How you doing, guys? Just like to welcome you to our first talk today at the Zero Waste Festival in the Science Gallery. We have a great speaker here, Dr. Brian Kelleher, who's going to be speaking to us about how the opportunities and challenges in dealing with municipal waste. So just like to coordinate the deal of Brian Kelleher. Carmela.
Thank you very much, Brian, and thank you for inviting me. My name is Brian Kelleher, and today I'll concentrate on the organic fraction or component of waste and ways to minimize carbon emissions from that fraction, and also can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Ways to minimize carbon emissions from the organic fraction of waste, and also to maximize our use of what is a valuable material. So this is the organic component. So that's if we just think domestically, that's our kitchen and garden waste, really. So if it's organic, that means there's a lot of carbon in it, and therefore our use, our disposal of it, our processing of it is going to influence in some way the carbon cycle without any doubt. So we want to keep it in the right place where it's useful, it can provide nutrients, it can help us all, rather than it going into the atmosphere as CO2 or methane. That's our big challenge. So if you don't mind then, seeing that we're talking about carbon, I'm going to take a step back first of all and have a look at the carbon cycle, because I think sometimes it's very interesting to see what we know about carbon, the carbon cycle, and what we know we don't know, and then there's also unknown unknowns, definitely, about the carbon cycle. So I'll start off like that, and I'll use, at this stage, this is old enough, but it still gives a nice depiction of what we know about the carbon cycle, where carbon exists, and how much in relative terms is in the different sources and sinks. So, of course, you can see figures here, and, of course they can't be completely accurate, but what we know fairly well is that it's the relative amounts. It's the relative amounts of carbon, so where it mainly exists and where it exists in smaller quantities. So carbon, as we know, it exists in many different forms. The carbon that we're maybe more familiar with is the CO2 carbon in the atmosphere. That exists again in many forms, but mainly as CO2 and methane. And of course it's a natural, at this stage in geological time, it's a natural part of the atmosphere. We need CO2 in the atmosphere, there's no doubt about that. The greenhouse effect is a natural phenomenon that we require for us to live on Earth. It keeps the Earth warmer, much, much warmer than it would be. So it's a good thing. The problem is, of course, is that we've emitted too much carbon, and now we have too much there, to such a degree that it's getting warmer. So that's a fairly simple form of carbon, CO2, up there. It also exists in many other forms. For example, dissolved organic carbon, if you look there, now these figures, by the way, that means 700 billion tons of carbon, and as I say, just treat them as relative amounts. Dissolved organic carbon, that is the carbon that's in the oceans, lakes, and here. So there's dissolved organic carbon here. It's one of, if not the most stable form of carbon, and by stable I mean that it's it's unlikely under present conditions that it will mineralize or become CO2 and be added to the atmosphere. It's carbon because it's been regurgitated many times it's stable because it's been regurgitated by microbes many times. And it's made up of thousands of different organic chemicals. And the one thing I do know about this form of carbon is that we don't know. We know a fair amount about it, but our analytical techniques are simply not advanced enough to separate those thousands of compounds to find out about their structures. And why is that important? It's an interesting pursuit, obviously, but if we don't know the chemical characteristics of these forms of carbon, then we won't be able to predict what will happen to that carbon in a changing or a warming environment. If we do have a 2-3 degree increase in temperature, can we expect carbon like that to end up in the atmosphere? Now, I'd say of all the carbons that this is the most unlikely, even under those extreme conditions, to become part of the atmosphere. But who knows? We don't know. So, one interesting thing, so you have DOC, dissolved organic carbon. You also carbon exists as soil. Again, very, very complex, but different in that there's two main fractions, what we like to call labile and recalcitrant. Recalcitrant is the carbon that's very stable, the stable part of soil, but then a lot of it is what we call labile, and that means it's not so stable. It's made up of sugars and small compounds that are easily degraded, so they cycle naturally between the atmosphere and soil. So again, the question that we have to try and answer is what will happen to that kind of carbon and even the recalcitrant carbon under a changing environment. So what is interesting, I think, about this kind of a depiction of carbon is the relative amounts. So in the atmosphere, 750 billion tons of carbon about. We've nearly doubled the amount of carbon through our combustion of fossil fuels in the last 200 years in the atmosphere. Soils and organic matter, about 1,600, maybe double atmospheric. Coal deposits, 3,000, not that much. Look at oil and gas, there's only 300 billion tons of carbon, we think, or approximately, of course, in oil and gas deposits. That's less than that is in the atmosphere. 3,000 in coal deposits, again, it's not that much relatively speaking. So where does most of the carbon exist in a carbon cycle? It exists in marine sediments and sedimentary rocks. And about 66 million to 100 million billion tons, we think, of carbon exists in this form. So again, there's a lot of similarities between this kind of carbon in the sediments, dissolved organic carbon, soils, even atmospheric, but there's also differences. Again, it's very, very complex, and really our most advanced technology, we still cannot. When you think of oil has been so important for our existence, we'll say, for the last 200 years or so, but we still don't know the components, the chemical components of oil, because it's so difficult to separate on chromatography columns. We still can't do it. It's a humbling thought. So most carbon exists in sediments. So people who study carbon in these forms, that's one of the main reasons to study it. There are many other reasons, but we want to try and get a handle on what will happen if the deeper ocean becomes warmer. In that scenario, will a lot of this mineralize to become, say, methane under anaerobic conditions, or carbon dioxide, and will it reach the atmosphere? It has a long way to go, obviously, and there's a lot of microbes that like carbon there. It's very complex, but we still haven't really got a handle on that. So that's what I like, the old known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. I didn't make that up, obviously, but I like to refer to the carbon cycle in these terms. We know this. Then there's the unknown, or the known unknowns. And that is that since the Industrial Revolution, it's not that difficult to work out how much carbon we've emitted through combustion of fossil fuels. We have a good idea how much fossil fuels we've extracted from the ground or wherever, so we can work out how much CO2 we've emitted. And there still is a consensus that there's about 25% of that missing. In other words, we don't know where 25% of that CO2 has ended up, and methane. So we know that the oceans obviously are a very large sink. They take up an awful lot of carbon. Soils, plants, trees, obviously, peat, bogs. But we're still not sure about that other 25%. And we know that, but of course the problem there is that if we don't know where it is, we don't know how it will react under a changing environment. If the planet is warming, what form of carbon is that in? Is it in a stable form? Is it unstable? Will it end up in the atmosphere? We don't know. So that's very humbling as a scientist, and I don't think I think it's a good idea to realize that really in a lot of ways we know very little, especially in terms of carbon cycling. So carbon cycling is an umbrella term. It cycles in many, many ways. It cycles in water and rocks, but the mechanism that we're most familiar with, and we probably, well, definitely most rely on, is photosynthesis, because without it we wouldn't be here. Photosynthesis, and obviously this is just a bit of revision for us all. Photosynthesis is when plants and microbes take up CO2 and water from the atmosphere and use the energy of the sun to transform the water and CO2 to small sugars and eventually larger polymers and that kind of thing that make up plant tissue. And in that way, plants can grow, microbes can grow. We eat the plants, or we eat animals that eat the plants. So we from a food point of view, obviously photosynthesis is hugely important for us. Now, just if you don't mind, I'll just mention another form of carbon capture that doesn't ever get much of it's not talked about at all, and in fact in any carbon cycling modelling, this form of carbon capture isn't considered at all, and it's called chemosynthesis, and it's mostly associated with the bottom of the oceans, in particular hydrothermal vents. And it's the same as photosynthesis, it's just the start of the word begins with chem, so it can happen in the dark, in the absence of light, so it doesn't require the energy from the sun. It's done usually by microbes at the bottom of the ocean, and they glean their energy from breaking chemical bonds. So they munch on chemical bonds, extract the energy, and then do the same thing that happens in photosynthesis. They take up carbon, they take up water, and they build their cell structures that way. We have recently shown that this occurs very much so in agricultural soil too. In fact, if under the right conditions, soil sucks up CO2 through the chemosynthetic mechanism. And it's just an aside, but I bring it up again just to try and reiterate the fact that there are many things about the carbon cycle that we don't know. So, food. Food, of course, our consumption, our production, everything that happens with food has a carbon footprint one way or the other. Obviously, when we produce food, all the processes that go into producing food have a carbon footprint, no doubt about it. Now, we have to eat. I'm particularly fond of my food. And so that's fine. And there are ways that we can reduce the carbon footprint without any doubt. And a lot of those are very obvious to us all at this stage. But food production, these are just a few of the things, obviously, that food has to go through, but they all require energy, which usually requires carbon. So things like deforestation, land use change, fertilizer manufacture and use, refrigeration, storage, transportation, packaging, processing and production. So these are all energy intensive operations. So there's a carbon, as I say, cost to the food that we produce. And of course, as I say, that's fine, we have to survive. But when you then consider food waste, and some of these percentages I only found out yesterday when I was preparing this talk, and first one, 30% of food is wasted globally. Okay, now I can imagine that in my own life. I can imagine that. The next one then, this is amazing. That the food waste that's wasted contributes 8% of total global greenhouse gas emissions. 8% of our carbon emissions, carbon that gets into the atmosphere, is because of food waste. That is shocking. That is unbelievable. But it's also obviously a big opportunity, a huge opportunity. If we can change that, surely we can change that. 8%. Well, of course, there's other ways of explaining that. If food waste were a country, it would come in third after the United States and China in terms of impact on global warming. That's how big it is. And that's where the opportunity lies, of course. Cutting down on food waste could result in the prevention of more than 70 billion tonnes of greenhouse gases being released into the atmosphere. So I was astounded at this. So it seems to come from fairly strong work by people like this, but also there's many papers that seem to point to the same kind of figures, 8%. Approximately, obviously. So we're coming down all the time now. We're come down to Ireland now. There's a few figures here. Again, you're probably familiar with, but we just want to put it into the Irish context. The thing I'd like to stress also is that the trends in Ireland are good. There's no doubt about that there has been a big improvement in the last 10 to 15 years. Even the bins we use, that people that use the brown bin, that means that organic waste has been treated properly. That wasn't happening 10 years ago. So the trends are good, but obviously there's an awful lot more that we need to do and we have to do. So these are figures mainly supplied by the EPA and the Irish Waste Management Association. So first of all, well, organic waste, I heard a nice way of describing it lately as anything that was recently living, or organic matter, that's organic waste. That's accurate. We produce 15 million tonnes of waste every year in Ireland, a huge amount, and no matter what technologies I talk about, whatever, we have to reduce that. That's it. We simply have to reduce our waste. We know that. Only 41% is recycled. The rest is either landfilled or incinerated to recover energy. So this is one of our major current problems. When you throw organic matter into landfill, it's wasted from 2 points of view. First of all, it's likely at some stage to enter the atmosphere as methane unless it's caught. There are efforts to try and catch it, but you can't catch it all. So it's going to degrade under anaerobic conditions, becomes methane, a very strong greenhouse gas, and it's lost. Or it's lost to the atmosphere. But you're also losing, of course, a very valuable resource that if it was composted, say, added to soil, it's a soil nutrient. It locks the carbon in soil where it's doing well. So really, you're going from a disaster of a situation where it's emitted into the atmosphere, and then the other extreme is it's a very valuable resource that if used properly is valuable and means that we don't have to apply as many or any artificial fertilizers. Incineration, at least with incineration you can have an energy recovery. It can heat homes or whatever, but it's still an awful waste, because when you combust or when you incinerate, most of it goes up as carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So it's not ideal at all. So we don't want this to happen with our organic waste. And then, of course, the EPA estimates that there's huge amounts that are unmanaged. So by unmanaged, you can use your imagination there. Who knows what happens to it there. So, there's a lot of work. 16% of the general waste bin is organic. So that doesn't seem like much, but we are all still putting a lot of organic material in our general waste bin, and that's a bit of a disaster too. Just before I'll go back to that, but the EPA also suggests that for non-household waste, so that's industrial, service industry, retail, that kind of thing, there could be a 4-fold increase in food and garden waste sent for composting, which means that there's huge amounts that are going to incineration and landfill that shouldn't be, still from we'll say, the industrial sector. So there's huge rooms for improvement. Now, again, I'll just emphasize that the trend is good, and the will is definitely now there. And I've been lucky enough I've worked with farmers and people in this industry for the last 20 years, and one thing I've found is that they're very resourceful, proactive, and there is a big will there among the farming community to change, and there has been for quite a while, because policy and regulation has to catch up in many cases. So this 16% will concentrate on that. Once it goes into a black bin, it's mixed with all other sorts of waste. Then it becomes much, much harder to treat and much harder to save. You can compost it, yes. You can mechanically separate it, as we'll see. But of course, that has an energy price. And at the end of the day, you get a contaminated product. You can't get rid of all the metals. You can't get rid of all the plastics. So you don't have, say, a compost that you can sell. Nobody would buy it. Nobody would use it. And what happens at the moment is that that's landfilled. So it has to go through mechanical processing, and then it's landfilled. All of this has a carbon footprint and an energy requirement. So this is a nice project that I'm involved in, and Jessica is up there who's involved in the project too. This is a project that involves us in DCU, Enrich Environmental Limited. They are a composting company in County Meath who run a very nice operation there. If you notice here, these are windrows. They compost, say, garden waste and municipal organic waste, and they can sell that on then. It's a very valuable material for whoever needs it. Of course, in Ireland, we don't have that much of a requirement, we think, for organic matter, because we have plenty of it in soils, we think. But overall, soil organic matter, remember, it's decreasing as a component of soil in Europe and even in Ireland. So while we think, and we do have a lot more organic carbon soil in Ireland than in other places, obviously, in the world, it's decreasing. So this is exactly what you want to do. You want to add waste material like this compost to soils to replenish it in a natural way. So this project, we call it Valorization Alternatives to Landfill for Organic Residues. It's us, Enrich, and we call it Valor. It's funded by the EPA and the Southern Waste Region. So what we're interested in is that organic material in our black bin waste. So what it's called is mechanically separated organic fraction of municipal solid waste. So when you have your black bin, there's organic matter in it, you want to separate out all the components. And you can do that through mechanical processing. As I say, it has a carbon footprint, but this is the only way we have. It's not the ideal situation. We don't want organic material in our black bins. That's the ideal, but until we get there, we have to come up with ways of saving this material, stopping it going into the atmosphere, and using it as the valuable resource it is. So after it's mechanically separated, the fine fraction produced upon the trommel separation during mechanical treatment of residual waste, so you've separated mostly the organic fraction. The problem is, of course, you can't get rid of all the small plastics and the metals, so you can compost it, and it's a highly nutritious, we'll say, material, but it still has that contamination. So what can we do with it? At present, it's bio-stabilised, and by that we mean it's composted. So composting takes about 4 to 12 weeks, and it stabilises it. It gets rid of pathogens. It means that it's stable as regards its carbon. The carbon is not going to degrade quickly. It's not going to become part of the atmosphere. So it's a stable material. At the moment, though, that is landfilled and incinerated. So that's our big problem. So we don't want that to happen, and we're trying our best to stop it. And there are options. There are a lot of technology options out there. One of the problems is, I would say, is that policy and regulation has to catch up. So our objectives are to determine suitable recovery processes for reuse of these materials, to assess the risks and benefits, because obviously, as I say, you're going to have contaminants, metals, plastics, to validate the use of this material for land remediation and restoration. This may be a good use for this material in the restoration of sites that are already contaminated, such as old mine sites or whatever. And we're characterising the plastic content in the source separated soil amendments. So these are some of the, I don't know how familiar you are with these, but these are the main technologies. They're all established technologies. And we want to see what is the most suitable, or we have to try and see what is most suitable for the type of material we're talking about. So, what we're doing within the project is we're trying all of this. We've had some success in some places, in others maybe not. So you have three main types of conversions where we can convert this material into a usable, valuable energy source or soil amendment, something like that. So we can use thermal conversion, and of course thermal conversion is not just incineration. If you combust things under different conditions, different oxygen concentrations, different temperatures, then you can produce gases that can be burnt, then used to produce electricity or energy. You can produce charcoals, tars that could be used for chemicals, chemical feedstocks. You can produce a lot of things from thermal conversion of that material. So the first thing we had to do was look for the calorific potential within the material, and we're glad to say that it has potential. So there's definitely potential for thermal conversion. So we're working with our friends in University of Limerick, J.J. Leahy. He's been looking at thermal processing of waste materials for a long time, so we can use his facilities freely, which is great, because otherwise they'd cost a lot. So that's one of the next things we're going to do. Then what's known as biological conversion, where we rely on microbes to convert the material, or at least some of the material, to usable energy forms. So anaerobic digestion, you're probably familiar with. You can produce methane from that. We're getting tests done again in UCC. Professor Jimmy Murphy, he's again providing the analysis free for us, which is great, to see if there is a potential to do this with the material that we have. And initial signs are good. Fermentation is a very interesting one. Jessica has done great work with our friends in Portugal, where they're more advanced than us here in the biological conversion of this type of material, where we can produce bioethanol, and that bioethanol can be used as a fuel that can run cars. You can also use the ethanol industrially, or there's many uses for ethanol. And this looks fairly promising. It's a very promising process also because it gets rid of a lot of the contaminants, or at least it separates a lot of the contaminants for us during the process, which is a big plus. So that's looking promising. This other possibility is extraction of the fatty material to produce diesel, biodiesel. So for diesel, you need a large fat component in the compost. Initial results are that the fat component isn't that high enough for this to be a runner, really. I'm afraid, so far anyway. So the thing about this, all of those, is that at the end, yes, you can glean energy and heat from this combusted material, but you're still going to have something that's left over, of course. You're going to have residue. And the ideal and what we're aiming for is to keep using as much as possible, and making sure that the carbon is used at least in a valuable way. So there are other possibilities, technical possibilities for the residues. You could either, of course, there's many ways you can couple these technological approaches. You could either compost before or after, but either way you're going to end up with a residue. And there's a possibility of using that as a soil amendment, especially if you can get rid of those contaminants. You could also pyrolyze it again to produce biochar and more energy. So it's not going to be a one technology fits all, really. It's going to probably be two, if not three, to use this valuable material properly. So what should be apparent there is that the technology is definitely there. There's no doubt about that. The problem at the moment is, just imagine a company, they set up a bioethanol facility and they produce bioethanol. That's great, but they have to sell it, they have to make money. So if you're doing that on your own, it's not likely you're going to have many customers. It has to be organised really on a larger scale, and policy we have to decide from a national point of view what we're going to do. Do we want to produce mainly gas and therefore build the infrastructure to use gas? Are we going to use bioethanol? There are some of the questions, and those questions are still out there, I'm afraid. So in many ways we're working in the dark, but it goes both ways. We need to inform the policymakers, and this is the way to do it. At least we'll be able to go to them and say, right, we can do A, B, and C, we can't do the rest. That will help. So let's see. So this is just an example of then another experiment we're doing. When we compost the material, as I say, it's a lovely compost, but the problem is it's contaminated. So the fear and the danger of a contaminated compost, if you add it to soil or whatever, is that you're going to leach contaminants or pollutants. So we're doing a lot of leaching. Jessica up there is doing a lot of leaching experiments, and funny enough, we don't find anything bad. Now we're not suggesting that we add this material to agricultural soils, but we are suggesting that it could be used for restoration. It could be used for different kind of fillings or landscaping or whatever. There should be a lot of uses from this, and it does look like it's a stable material that doesn't cause any problems, but we still have a bit of work to do on that, and we don't want to claim anything yet. Okay, just lastly, of course, the residue that's left, there is a whole lot of potential, and we're not looking at this at the moment in our project, but you can extract the same types of products from these type of natural materials as you can from oil. Now, it's not going to substitute for oil because we use a hell of a lot of oil, but we can extract all these types of things. We can even extract pharmaceuticals, there's no doubt about that. There's a wealth of opportunity that way. There's a lot of work being done on something called polyhydroxyalkanoates. They're bioplastics, and they exist in this material, and they're produced by microbes. So you can get all sorts of valuable materials from biomass such as this. So really we don't have an excuse. The technology is there. We just have to get together now and formulate plans and policy. Lastly, I just found this also, it is estimated that worldwide implementation of composting can reduce emissions by 2.3 billion tonnes over the next 30 years. So composting, remember, it's a way of stabilising carbon, but still locking up all those nutrients, all the good things we need for soil and plant growth. So, that project is largely spearheaded by Jessica, who's up there. Without any doubt, she's doing brilliant work on the analysis and everything. Brian Murphy also, he's an ex-PhD student of mine. He's now senior environmental scientist in Enrich. And Tim Duggan and Miriam Carney of Enrich, they're very proactive and very progressive, and it's great to work with people like that. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. If you have any questions.
If there are any questions, please, there's a few microphones going around, so if anyone wants to ask a question, fire ahead there.
Hi, this is a really basic, simple question actually probably, but it's what actually happens to what we put into the brown bin when it's taken away. Yeah. What happens to what's in the brown bin?
This, well, to some degree, and actually Jessica could answer this better than me, but there are other, they compost it.
And how do they do that?
Leave it in large piles for about 12 weeks, 4 to 12 weeks. They turn it, don't they, Jessica? Turn it, yeah, because it has to be aerated. So it's a mechanical turning, and it just decomposes in a way and becomes more stable. That's it. It's simple on a large scale, but I tell you, trying it at home is not easy. And yeah, I can vouch for that.
I do compost at home, but I just often wondered. So they take the brown bin, they take the stuff from the brown bin, and they drive it somewhere.
Yeah. To facilities, to
right,
facilities such as this, yes, and compost it.
And compost it over a period of 12 weeks, and then does it
then
go to the
it's a commercial
industry?
Product. Then, if you can compost it, yeah.
Okay.
It's a very good resource. Yeah.
Okay.
Of course, years ago we used to give it to the pigs, and whatever. But we won't be going back to that too soon, maybe.
Okay. Thank you.
Hi, I just had a question about packaging. I've noticed, especially in the last 18 months or so, lots of restaurants trying to do their best are giving containers that say compostable, but when you look at the very small print, I think it's something like compostable on a commercial basis. Yeah. And I think lots of restaurants are genuinely trying to do the right thing, but I wonder, are some of the suppliers maybe, being a bit hijacking is too strong of a word. Yeah. I mean, it's better than what was there before.
Yes.
It's not plastic, but I think it might be contaminating a lot of bins.
Yeah, there seems to be there's a difference between biodegradable and compostable. Biodegradable is good, but it won't compost in the times within the times that they need it to commercially. So if you go out to Enrich, you sometimes see, after they've composted, a whole load of these cups that are there contaminating it. So I don't know actually if you get some of these cups say biodegradable. So that's not compostable then should be compostable within the amount of time that it takes to compost. But I haven't seen that. Jessica, does it work? Do you know?
I think there's still a bit of controversy in there because there's definitely
have you ever seen a cup compost?
To see exactly if it's happening.
Yeah. Have you ever seen a cup? I know you might not in this kind of scenario. In the 4 to 12 week cycle, has a cup ever composted? I want.
So one of the things I do when I sample is I go through people's waste and I pick plastics, right? And I certainly have seen at the little ones I can't. I don't know where they come from, but the big portions of plastic films, I certainly have seen the ones that are supposed to be biodegradable. It's just a matter of maybe pick the one that not only says that, but that actually certified by a bio.
Okay.
Which tend
Yeah.
to be more expensive,
Yeah.
but you have a bit more.
Yeah.
Maybe you have another insurance that's going to be covered.
Yeah. So read the fine print, I suppose.
Just a question on like long-term planning. So obviously, biofuels from waste streams are fantastic, but I think that they make a lot less sense when it comes from things like energy crops and stuff. If we build up our infrastructure for biofuels to match the output of our waste streams and then aim to significantly reduce those waste streams, is there a worry that the source of biomass then might move to kind of traditional biomass like lumber and stuff like that?
Yeah. That's the ideal. That's the way I would look at it, is that this is just in the meantime.
Okay, so you'd be making and then removing that infrastructure later.
Well, but as you say, there's other forms of biomass. There's agricultural waste, for example, that if we decided to gasify it or produce bioethanol, the infrastructure could still be used in that way. There's other forms of waste that you could glean a lot of energy from. So yeah, the hope is that we don't have to rely on this in years to come. Definitely.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
If like a material says that it's biodegradable, like face wipes or like a bag that's almost like plastic, but it says it's biodegradable, which bin should you put it in?
Yes, good question. If it biodegradable isn't compostable, as far as I know, so that would go in. Yes, good question. That would go into general waste, I'd say.
So like, what's the difference between the term biodegradable and compostable?
The cups is a good. The cups are a good example. So when you throw a biodegradable cup, so biodegradable is good. It means that it's not going to exist in the environment forever. Come get washed up on our shores and that kind of thing. That's good. Yeah. But if you put a biodegradable cup in the compost, then what you find, and I've seen it myself out in Enrich, after the composting project, you see a whole lot of cups that haven't composted. And these are people, this is their business, they have to sell the compost, so they can't be taken. That takes a lot of work to get that out. So it's just, it's a commercial inconvenience at least.
So like, if there is like two options, one that's biodegradable and one that's just like plastic, would the biodegradable one?
Oh, I'd go for the biodegradable one, yeah.
But if it's put in an incinerator or something, would it be any better? Like if it's going to the general waste bin anyway?
Well, yeah, the best thing is not to use it at all, I'm afraid, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it probably will, at this stage, go incinerated or landfill, yeah.
How many weeks or months does a biodegradable cup take? Because maybe I could put it in my home compost rather than putting it in a takeaway compost.
Yeah, I couldn't answer that question because it would depend on the material. It can take years sometimes, but yes, you could leave it in your compost. To be a good experiment. I couldn't answer that question, sorry, because it varies. You know, it depends on the material. But it would be, it'd be interesting to do that. See how long it lasts.
You were talking about fuels such as bioethanol and biodiesel. So I was wondering if, like in the future, if we start using this, I mean, it's obviously a better fuel, say if you say bioethanol, in terms of cleanliness than petrol.
Yeah.
But the problem at this time is, right, we are still emitting a lot of carbon. So bioethanol, it's alcohol. We would still be emitting a lot of carbon if you start using it in the future, right?
Yeah. Well, there's no doubt about that. It still is using carbon, but at least we're recycling it. Yeah, but it's not ideal, no. You'd rather use renewable energy that's non-carbon, without doubt. The ideal is that we separate it and use it in a soil amendment, compost it and use it as a soil amendment, that's it. But you can't, in this case you can't do that, so what else do we do with it? We don't want it, if you combust it or incinerate it, go straight up. At least if you use it as a fuel, you're reusing the carbon again before it, but it does go up, yes. Yeah, it's not ideal, and that's not what we want to do ultimately. We want to get away from carbon.
I'd like to thank Dr. Brian Kelleher.
Thank you.
Great talk. Big tour of us. Thanks, Flash. Our next talk starts at reverb. Our next talk starts at 2 o'clock. It's Dr. Una Fitzgerald. She's going to be giving a great talk on Zero Waste Lab. You're more than welcome to come along to that as well. Thank you very much. I'll be back in a few minutes.